Norman Cornish was a leading British artist of the 20th century, whose work was held in public and private collections throughout the UK and abroad. He passed away in 2014, and we, his family, have become involved in a number of significant projects, which you can read about if you visit the Norman Cornish website. I spent a lot of time with Norman in conversation. He was an intellectual, a deep thinker, and he often asked how I thought he would be remembered. I knew there were many sketchbooks in his studio and realised that it was important to ask him what he would like to happen to them when the time came. And this is what he said. The sketchbooks give an insight into Norman's approach towards gathering information for his subject material. Early in his career, he was encouraged by Bill Farrell at the Spennymoor settlement to paint what he wanted, what he knew, and this is a thread which runs throughout all of the sketchbooks. Norman's jacket was adapted by his wife Sarah, who created a poacher's pocket on the inside, large enough to hold his sketchbook and flowmaster pen, so that wherever he went, his sketchbook and pen were always with him. He often said that painting and drawing was like an itch that had to be scratched. The pages contain colour notes, comments about composition, light and shade, historical information and regular to-do lists. The sketchbooks also contain letters and personal observations about a wide range of contemporary topics, and these appear in italics as direct comments from Norman. Some other quotations are also included, where appropriate, from other sources. The flowmaster pen was Norman's favourite medium, and it was the forerunner of the modern fibre tip pen and was filled with a permanent ink that dried in 2 seconds. Speed and accuracy were therefore essential. Anne often said it was as though Norman's pen was linked directly to his brain, so that whatever subject caught his attention, he could record instantly. The nibs, both bullet and chisel shapes, varied in size. The tone of the line could be varied by applying different pressure, and Norman Cornish became a master of the technique. He first came across the pen in London in 1949, but couldn't afford the cost. Several years later, a friend, Ted Harrison, gifted Norman a flowmaster pen, and Ted went on to become one of Canada's leading artists. One of the key milestones in Norman's career was the broadcast by the BBC in 1963 of the authoritative arts programme Monitor, 2 border artists, Norman Cornish and Sheila Fell, which significantly raised Norman's profile to a wider audience nationally. The producer was a young Melvyn Bragg, who also wrote the foreword to Norman's autobiography, A Slice of Life, published in 1989. No other person in this country is as well placed as Melvyn Bragg to take a long-term view about Norman's work and his emergence during the past 50 years as one of the leading British artists of the 20th century. We were naturally delighted when Melvyn Bragg agreed to write the foreword to support this publication. 4 other writers were invited to contribute essays about Norman's work and place it in the context of the cultural landscape of his era. Keith Mcintyre of Northumbria University writes about the drawings. Keith Wilson places Norman's work in the context of the Durham coalfield. Pam Royal talks about the role of women. The Starry Night. This very early version of the Pit Road is typical of Norman getting an idea down quickly onto a scrap of paper. He was aware of Van Gogh's life and work, but Norman's Starry Night is experiential, unlike the imaginary composition of Van Gogh. Unable to continue in education, he had 5 younger brothers and 1 sister. He started work at Dean and Chapter Colliery on Boxing Day 1933, age 14. The colliery was one of over 100 at various stages of opening and closing within a 5-mile radius of Spennymoor. Their impact upon the environment was pervasive. I remember seeing this initial idea for the pit road and realised quickly that although it was only a few brushstrokes, it was actually the beginning of a whole series of variations of a theme which was such a compelling subject. The following images reveal the development of this theme working towards a perfect composition. There is often a misconception that an artist works on a canvas and immediately creates a perfect composition. With Norman's approach, there is a carefully constructed series of steps, often experimenting with colour, shapes and medium to arrive at that perfect composition. One day, at an exhibition several years ago, a child asked Norman why the lights in his pit road paintings looked as though they were exploding. He replied that when raindrops get into your eyes on a dark night, this is the effect that they would have. Norman's favourite medium was pastel, but he was equally competent in watercolour, pen, charcoal and oils. Norman's approach to capturing subject material would be inspired by a specific location. He would get something down quickly in his sketchbook, add colour notes and other statements, and sometimes take a photograph, and then return to his studio to work at developing a painting. Norman worked on themes repeatedly and almost obsessively, wrestling in his mind to find a faultless composition. Many of his themes can be seen running through different seasons and times of day and night. One of Norman's contemporaries and personal friends was the author Sid Chaplin. They were both members of the Spennymoor settlement, as well as workmates at the Dean and Chapter Colliery. Sid Chaplin's son, Michael, delivered the eulogy at Norman's funeral in 2014. It was later broadcast by BBC Radio 4, Last Words. Michael also describes the scene in miners walking along the pit road. Loneliness hangs on the shoulders of its solitary figures, and there is menace in the jagged fencing and tilting telegraph poles. These are the images that haunt my imagination, for of course the figures are my father and grandfather, and maybe yours too. The pit gantry clearly made a huge impression on Norman. On his first day at work he was greeted with the comment, "You have just signed your death warrant, son." Nevertheless, the pit gantry was to provide a huge source of inspiration throughout his career. And when they climbed the gantry, they looked like fireflies trapped in a steel spider's web. Norman Cornish and L.S. Lowry were contemporaries who exhibited together on many occasions from 1951 in Carlisle and more frequently at the Stone Gallery in Newcastle in the 1960s and early 70s. Lowry bought 2 of Norman's paintings, one of which was a version of the gantry. The Dean and Chapter Colliery was known as the butcher's shop, in view of the frequency and number of accidents. The dangers of gas, stone falls, the darkness and the restricted space were all to shape these men into what Norman called industrial gladiators. There is huge symbolism in Norman's depiction of telegraph poles and a crucifixion. He was always obsessed by shapes, and especially those which would be symbolic of things beyond themselves. He sometimes spoke of the men being treated like slaves and spoken to like convicts. Norman's studio was donated to the Beamish Museum in 2014, although it is now on loan to Spennymoor Town Council and forms a key feature of the Coming Home exhibition. Norman and Sarah left Bishop's Close Street in 1967 as Norman retired from mining to finally become a professional artist after 32 years working underground. The family home in Whitworth Terrace was a huge terraced house, previously owned by a Methodist minister, and the church office became Norman's studio for the next 35 years, a period of time as a professional artist longer than his time underground as a miner, a fact often overlooked. The studio was perfect in size, storage, and natural light from a north-facing window. For many years, a low-level table was in the centre of the room to enable those who requested portraits to be painted by Norman to be at eye level with the artist. On one occasion, a letter was received by Norman to host a visit from members of the Friends of the Tate Gallery. On the day of the visit, 40 people arrived by coach and were warmly welcomed. The studio was also the venue for many famous actors, musicians, TV personalities and politicians to visit and converse with Norman. Appointments were made by letter, as Norman resisted ownership of a telephone until much later in life, in case it disturbed his concentration. Norman joined the Spennymoor Settlement Sketching Club when he was 15. He received very important advice from the warden, Bill Farrell, to paint the things you know, the things around you. In this image, Norman has observed maintenance work on the telegraph pole visible from his studio window. Men and dogs were a common sight in Spennymoor and provided an obvious subject for attention, sometimes just waiting with a dog on a lead or sitting at a bench with a dog. Although Norman was denied the opportunity to study at the Slade School of Art due to lack of funding, he nevertheless gained considerable knowledge about the work of other artists, art movements and art schools. Initially with access to books and magazines at the settlement, and later by building a significant library of books about other artists who in turn may have influenced Norman's development. Here we see Norman's mother alongside the young Italian woman in 1895 by Paul Cézanne. Norman possessed a remarkable ability to capture people and places, working rapidly with a keen eye and attention to appropriate detail with his Flowmaster pen. The beer in Norman's glass gave him the passport to be able to share, observe and record communal life. Because he could blend in, this gave him the opportunity to produce so many character drawings of his subjects. The most significant influence on Norman's development as an artist was Rembrandt. Like Rembrandt, he produced a series of self-portraits spanning his life from youth. He was also fascinated by Rembrandt's attention to the humble and mundane activities of everyday life. Norman was intrigued by the fact that Rembrandt could paint such a formal composition as the Night Watch, and be equally interested to produce an etching of a peasant woman relieving herself by the roadside, an everyday occurrence in 17th century Holland. Bar scenes are synonymous with Norman's body of work. It is interesting to discover that they are very carefully researched so that details are precise. There were 37 pubs in Spennymoor during Norman's era, and a similar number in the wider district. As an underground miner, he was not an outsider, as, for example, was L.S. Lowry, the rent collector in Salford. Lowry was an outsider looking in on his subjects, while Norman was accepted in his community, he recorded. I remember the occasion in Norman's studio when I discovered a piece of paper with a rough idea for a bar scene based on 3 guiding principles. Human drama based on gesture and attitude. It is monochromatic, with the accent on atmosphere. The resulting picture is simply stunning, and was purchased originally by the Scottish and Newcastle breweries for their boardroom. When they were taken over by Heineken, the painting was donated to the permanent collection at Northumbria University. Manet Bar with dog is a classic Cornish subject. The subject appears to be quite simple and straightforward. Actually, This is a very well composed alignment of a number of features, the twin beer pumps balanced with the hind legs of the dog. Cover the pumps or the dog's hind legs to see what happens to the composition. The two subjects are also full of curvilinear shapes which can be followed from the hind legs of the dog, along its body, the dog lead, the man's legs, trousers, jackets and hat. Norman was obsessed with shapes and people. In fact, he said that people make the shapes, I am just the medium. Norman often said that art is a form of communication and every picture has its own narrative. Two Men at a Bar with a Dog is clearly a development around a theme. We discovered several years ago that there was an underlying story, disclosed for the first time at the opening of the exhibition at Greenfield Arts Centre in Newton Aycliffe. Joe Hughes and Tosser Angus were miners just before the outbreak of World War II. The full, extraordinary story of their active service during the war is on page 85 of our book, Behind the Scenes, the Norman Cornish Sketchbooks. This sequence of images showing the development of a bar scene is a remarkable example of Norman at work developing a complex composition. He sets himself a challenge, and the calculations are part of the process in terms of proportions. As the figures in the composition are carefully placed, including the posture of the figures, a grid is finally introduced to scale up the picture to a larger size. Study each picture carefully to fully appreciate the changes as the final composition emerges. Norman was an artist who painted people, and the Berriman's chip van was an obvious good subject. There are many variations of this subject drawn from different angles and different times of the day and night. The three Berriman brothers had a perfect hourly shift system, one serving, one peeling potatoes and one in the pub. The Berriman's chip van is now at Beamish Museum and will be a feature in the 1950s town, currently under construction and including a recreation of the Cornish family home from 33 Bishop's Close Street from 1953 until 1967. This rare sketched portrait by Norman of L.S. Lowry was drawn during one of the exhibitions at the Stone Gallery in the 1960s. They first exhibited together at Tully House in Carlisle in 1951, the Northern Realists, and subsequently exhibited together on many other occasions in other parts of the country and frequently at the Stone Gallery, where Mick and Tilly Marshall were agents for Cornish and Lowry. A full list of the exhibitions is available to view via the Norman Cornish website. During the 1950s and 60s, Norman's burgeoning talent and recognition resulted in many requests for his work via the Stone Gallery in Newcastle. He would often travel to Newcastle from Spennymoor on a Saturday to visit the Stone Gallery, but also to meet other artists. His meandering journey across Newcastle from the old Marlborough Crescent bus station to the Stone Gallery near the Haymarket enabled Norman to see and draw other interesting people and places in and around Tyneside. Newcastle was a magnet to Norman, and his first oil painting of his sister Ella was exhibited at the Laying Art Gallery in 1941. On one occasion, Norman was accompanied by his friend Sid Chaplin to the biker area of Tyneside. Sid had already published The Day of the Sardine and The Watchers and the Watched, both of which were set in and around the biker area. Norman completed this almost faultless drawing of Biker Bridge, a wonderful cityscape, across 2 pages of his sketchbook. The drawing was never developed into a painting. Norman commented that because it straddled another world, to recreate it he must know the people who use it or live around it. Edward Street. When Norman was out walking, he often passed through this street on his way home, which was no more than a few minutes' walk past the church. He was particularly interested in the way that the street was crowned at the top by St. Paul's Church, another popular subject from his hometown, which he said had everything an artist needed. St. Paul's Church and Edward Street can be visited as part of the Norman Cornish Trail, which starts at Spennymoor Town Hall and takes just over an hour to walk. Norman has chronicled one of the most important passages in English history. His paintings and drawings of the hard-lived lives of a community which defied the odds will be enduring. He has preserved a life lived by millions of people in this country, and he has given it significance and permanence that only a real artist can achieve. This image is of the Holy Innocents Church at the back of Salvin Street in what is known as Low Spennymoor. Norman considered that we all possess a basic aesthetic response inside of us, which is above fashion or style or time. Norman was aware of the work of Peter Bruegel the Elder, and the development of this composition is revealed from the initial photograph through to the placement of 41 individual figures and the gradual opening of the diagonals supported by the people echoing similar shapes. Pause for a moment to see if you can work out what some of the adults may be saying to some of the children. Norman was born on Bishop's Close Street, and he and Sarah returned to live at number 33 in 1953, and they lived there until 1967. Sarah, Anne and John were obvious subjects to draw and paint in the family home. Two expressions dominated their early lives: "Don't move" and "hold it there," as he recorded the everyday life of his family in hundreds of deeply personal sketches. The street was surrounded by a gasworks, the old ironworks and railway line connecting coal trucks to the Dean and Chapter colliery. At the end of the street, around the corner, was a tunnel under the railway line, and it was the start of the walk to Dean and Chapter colliery at Ferry Hill, a distance of 3 miles. The street was a busy thoroughfare, with folks walking to and from work and children playing out. At the end of the street was the Arcadia Cinema and the Spennymoor High Street, where many pubs were located. It has always been difficult to give the exact location of most of the bar scenes. What these conversation pieces do show is a group of people interacting naturally in a clear and carefully considered structure with a highly complex design, which you can see as the initial composition is developed into a more complex arrangement. Other features and characters are gradually introduced, including the emphasis given to the dog, the darts player, and the men playing dominoes. This final version was only discovered in 2014, shortly after Norman and Sarah transferred to full-time residential care in Bishop Auckland. One day, Anne and I received a phone call from Lindsay, who had been their part-time housekeeper for many years. We lived a few miles away, and Lindsay said, "Can you come over straight away?" When we arrived, Lindsay announced that when clearing an upstairs wardrobe, she had found 3 large paintings on canvas rolled up. The Crowded Bar was one of them, which was revealed for the first time. You may have heard Professor Jean Brown of Northumbria University speaking on the BBC Radio 4 Today programme in November 2019, shortly before the exhibition opened at the Bowes Museum. In response to the question, "Will his work stand the test of time?" Jean replied with "Obviously, because it is up there with Rembrandt, Degas and Lautrec." Here, Jean is collecting samples of Norman's materials to be examined at Northumbria University and eventually subjected to instrumental analysis to establish a chemical profile for future reference to determine authenticity, just as in Fake or Fortune. The research project by the University of Northumbria is in collaboration with partners at Newcastle University and the University of Nara in Japan. The second of the 3 oil paintings, rolled up in the wardrobe at Whitworth Terrace, was eventually taken to the Laying Art Gallery in Newcastle. Here, Anna Flynn Young is explaining to Anne and John the process of restoration and treatment. The painting received surface treatment and conservation over a period of 12 months. A similar version of the restored painting, in black and white, appears in Sid Chaplin's collection of short stories from 1972, A Tree with Rosy Apples. Norman's work is often referred to as social realism, impressionist, expressionist. It doesn't really matter. We are left with a record of how life was, and because we can absorb its nuances from his art, we can connect with the past and the things that have made us who we are today. They help to give us a sense of pride and identity during a period of rapid social change. Early in 2019, Anne and I received a visit from Andrew Festing, who spent a day with us discovering more about Norman's life and work, but in particular, he was keen to view Norman's drawings in detail. Andrew was formerly president of the Royal Society of Portrait Painters between 1977 to 81, and for many years at Sotheby's he was principal expert in British painting. His view was that the quality of Norman's drawings was as good as any other artist in history.